for Workforce. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guest speaker today, who's going to be talking. Her session's talk is entitled "My History is Your History," and it's one of a series of events that we have been organising to mark October, Black History Month. Carol Leeming, our guest speaker, is an MBE, and she's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and is a polymath. And Carol Leeming was born in Leicester, is of Jamaican descent and Antiguan parentage. Carol is director and lead artist of Dare to Diva, a company that has been established for over 20 years. And Carol received the Queen's Honour of an MBE in 2019 for being a poet, playwright, and for her contribution to Leicester arts and culture. Carol has been hailed as a polymath by academics. In 2019, she was Alumni of the Month at De Montfort University. She's a UK Cultural Olympian of 2012. Carol is an elected Fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts. In 2023, Carol was appointed a Royal Literature Fund Lecturer for the Leicester First Ever Reading Round, September 2023, this year. Carol is a freelance, a multidisciplinary arts practitioner. Her roles include published poet, she's a writer, director, dramaturg, performer, singer, songwriter, musician, composer, a consultant, curator, and lecturer. In addition to being a public speaker, and in recent work includes dramaturgy for Streetwise Opera Company at Nottingham Playhouse. Carol was formerly a part-time lecturer in contemporary music theatre for the performing arts at De Montfort University. She is currently a visiting guest lecturer for Nottingham Trent University for their MA Creative Writing course, at Derby University in a Masters of Arts for Writing and Performance. Carol is currently a patron for the East Midlands Women Awards. Carol's public speaking topics are poetry and literature, Black history and heritage, Black feminism, Black curriculum and decolonising education, arts and heritage, Africology, Pan-African futurism and spirituality. Carol's role in Black British feminism is highlighted in the book Sisterhood and After, an oral history of the UK women's liberation movement, published by Oxford University Press. Some of Carol's public speaking roles have included being a TEDx speaker for De Montfort University, Oxford University Symposium, chair of Black Oxford Scholars, Common Threads and Taking the Might at international literature conferences. Carol's other achievements and awards, including Outstanding Woman in Arts and Media. The Women's Award she's chair of the Leicester Black History Season for several years. She's a Black Achievers Art Award winner for Arts and Entertainment. She's the African Caribbean Leicester's Forum Leicester City Council member. She's been shortlisted for the Leicester Africa Caribbean Citizens Award for Lifetime Achievement for Arts and Culture. She's a certified creative industries learning champion for Arts Council England. She writes of choreo poetry, is featured in the Cambridge University Companion to Black and Asian Literature. She's a multi-award winning writer. She's been shortlisted for the Emerson Tinniswood Award Society for Authors, Writers, a Guild, Great Britain for First Radio Drama. And countless other awards, including the Margaret Penfold Award for Media. In 2023, Carol was awarded an Arts Council England Developing Your Creative Practice grant for a research and development project for music composition for chorus and music ensemble. for her new choreo poem play, Go Where the Songs Are. This is to be a chamber opera set in Leicester and Jamaica in the 1990s and is supported by partners Curve Theatre, Writing East Midlands and Serendipity Black Arts Heritage Institute. And this final choreo poem, chamber opera, will complete a trilogy of choreo poem plays, all of which have been previously successfully produced and performed at Curve Theatre Leicester. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Carol Leeming, who's going to talk for 45 minutes, and then there'll be about that sort of time, and then there'll be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So over to you, Carol.
Well, first of all, can I say a warm welcome and a greeting to everyone who's here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today. I think you may have learnt that I'm a rather curious person, and I'm very much interested in always knowledge and learning new things. I'm committed to lifelong learning. So I'm going to make a start and start off with basically saying why Black history, and I'm going to start off with the symbol, which is the Sankofa bird, which is a symbol of Black History Month, which we celebrate in October. So Sankofa is an Akan word of the West African Ghana people that literally means go back and get it. So Sankofa bird is actually what's called an Adinkara symbol, and it depicts a mythical bird flying forward with its head turned backward, and the egg in its mouth represents the gems or knowledge of the past upon which wisdom is based. So it also signifies the generation to come and the generation now would benefit from that wisdom. And so each Adinkara symbol, it has a proverb. And the proverb accompanying the Sankofan bird is Sowawere fina waso Sankofa ayenke, which translates to, it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. So the Akan believe that the past illuminates the present and the search for knowledge is a lifelong process. The pictograph illustrates the quest for knowledge, while the proverb suggests the rightness of such a quest, as long as it is based on knowledge and right knowledge of the past. So San, to return, Ko, to go, and Fa, to look and to seek and to take. Thank you. So why does Black history matter, and what's its context in the UK? So Akwaba Adai-Sebo was a special projects officer for the former Greater London Council, and after speaking to young Black teenagers, discovered that they were reluctant to have anything to do to identify with Africa. And this was due to the negative representation of Africans in the media and the many distorted images about Africa. So he decided that this needed to be addressed and that he wanted to do something that includes positive representations of the whole of the African continent and its diaspora and heritage. So Black History Month is held every October in Britain. The aims are to promote knowledge of Black history and the experience, to disseminate information on positive Black contributions to society and the entire world, and to heighten the confidence and the awareness of Black people in their own cultural history, along with building greater awareness and appreciation within other communities in Britain and further afield. So there is also Black history held at a different time in America, which started with Carter G. Woodson in 1915 with the Negro Week. And of course, the American Black History Month started in 1926 and continues to the present day. But they don't have it in October. They have it, I think they have it around January in terms of that year. So why develop Black history? Well, I think we need to fundamentally change perceptions in creative and engaging ways by enriching our own experience and the lives of others, you know, by fully embracing the wealth of knowledge Black history can provide as an integral part of us and our own daily lives. So when we think of Black history, we really need to think of prehistory and very ancient times, right through the Industrial Revolution to the present. That is the span that we need to think about. And we need to think about that in terms of Africa and its diaspora, its people, the intellectual, physical, technological, and the resources, along with the actual land, the agricultural and the mineral resources that have always been needed to fuel and galvanize progress in the world at large. So, for Britain and many parts of the world, they've been able to thrive and were basically built on Africa and its diaspora and the history. And what we find is that the full extent of this is not fully taught or disseminated. Therefore, it's not properly understood. So that's whether it's our institutions, the media, or the society at large. So we need to address this in positive and imaginative ways in the spirit of discovery and joy of lifelong learning, and to aim to completely correct erroneous ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and information about Africa and its diaspora. So this needs to be done now and in the current time and for future generations so that we can enlarge our view of world history and, most importantly, put Africa and its diaspora back into its central place. Thank you. So, Alex, if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So, I just briefly want to say, when we talk about Black history, we actually talk about ancient Kemet often, and you will know it as Egypt, which is a Greek word, but Kemet, land of the Black, or land of the Blacks, is the actual word that these people use for themselves and their own land. So if I refer to Kemet and the Kemetans, that is who I'm talking about. And that's really where Black history starts. It doesn't start with transatlantic chattel slavery. If you could have the next slide. So when we look at ancient Kemet and we actually look at the people, I know when I was growing up I was born here, I went to an English school, we weren't really taught that the ancient Kemetans or Egyptians were in fact people of Africa, and therefore that they were Black people of various hues, but they certainly weren't Europeans. And that certainly wasn't reflected in Hollywood films that I watched, like Cleopatra, when I was a child growing up. So it's really important to understand that we have to correct erroneous historical narratives in relation to ancient Kemet and Egypt, because we understand that Greek civilization studied literally at Kemet, and everything that the Greek civilization was able to bring forward into the world, they learnt from ancient Kemet, although of course the ancient Kemetans didn't actually tell them all their secrets. If we could have the next slide, please. So let's go back to Britain. And talking about Britain, we can go into prehistory in Britain because we have new archaeological finds that are really changing the narrative about Britain. So this is a picture of Beachy Head woman, and she was a woman of the 2nd century AD, and her, as usual, her remains were kept hidden for many years in a museum, and only recently have been tested and found to have been of African origin. And although she's not from she's not really a Roman as such. So we're getting all this new knowledge, which is helping us to change the narrative about the Black presence in Britain. The next slide, please. So here we have another woman, and this woman was found in Eastbourne, her skeleton, and sorry, this is a woman found in York. I do apologise, and she's called African Ivory Bangle Lady because of the jewellery that she had with her, and she is also of African descent. In fact, North African descent, and she was buried in York in the 4th century AD, and is the first black woman with proven evidence who lived in Britain. And these sort of discoveries, these newer archaeological discoveries, are really important. There's been another one which I think is referred to as Cheddar Man, and he's been, you know, remodeled and shown to have blue eyes and very, very dark brown skin. So all these kind of discoveries are beginning to change our perceptions and understanding about the black presence in Britain. So let's go to our next slide. So I just wanted at this point to make a reminder that's really important when we talk about Black history, that we have a highlight of Black history in Britain that happens in October, as I mentioned. But really and truly, Black history, my Black history, is your history, is our history. And Black history is something that happens really 365 days of the year. And we just have a highlight really in October. And the reason why I say all of that is that really we need to understand how we are all entangled together in terms of these histories. And it's just worth understanding that we need to continue to work to mainstream Black history, to not see it as a siloed matter, that actually it's something that we're all involved and we're all entangled with, and it's all part fundamentally of world history. Thank you. Okay, next slide. And also it's worth reminding ourselves where we are today. In terms of Black Lives Matter, that we need to understand that 500 years of the creation of ideology of racism still has a profound impact today and is something that we need to address and to tackle. So in the wake of Black Lives Matter, we need to continue to work to address systemic racism and discrimination and injustice within our society. Thank you. Yes, the next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight as part of this talk a very interesting project that came out of Leicester University that was led by a colleague of mine, Professor Corinne Fowler. And this was an interesting project that had young people, young children from junior school and academics and professional writers. It was a project, Colonial Countryside, that was set up to look at, it was also a project that was in partnership with the National Trust, to look at Britain's stately homes and to look at the links of the stately homes with transatlantic chattel slavery. And what was very interesting about this project was they looked at how the profits from slavery was used to build stately homes, but they went further than that. They went into the gardens and the orchards and found and conservatories and found fruit and trees that had been brought from colonies. And they also looked at the artifacts and the wooden furniture and the furnishings within the stately homes and found the links with colonies and links with chattel slavery. But this project did stir up a lot of controversy within the media, but I hasten to add that it was very, very well evidenced. And one of the comments of young people when they were taken to these stately homes and shown these homes and the artifacts is, they stated, why were we never taught about this? So I think Colonial Countryside now is offering guided tours to homes and giving narratives and contextualization around some of our stately homes in Britain. So it's a very interesting project. There is a book about it, and as I say, they are doing guided tours, and it made a very big contribution to our understanding of British history and the stately homes. Thank you. The next slide, please. So one of the things I do want to talk about when we're talking about the narratives around Britain is to talk about in the wake of transatlantic chattel slavery and imperialism and colonialism, and during the period of colonialism, is to highlight the contribution that were made by people from the colonies, for example, from Africa and from the Caribbean, and in particular, their contribution to the First World War.
Listening to this Black History webinar. I don't know how to.
Sorry, is there someone coming through there? Okay, I'll continue. So I just wanted to highlight the way in which African and African Caribbean servicemen made a massive and the ultimate contribution and sacrifice in terms of the First World War. But of course, some of them have graves that are still unmarked. In Africa, there was ancillary workers who worked on the Great War effort. Their graves are unmarked. And we do not celebrate enough. I think we have one piece of statuary in London that marks the contribution of Black servicemen in terms of the First World War. But it's well to note and highlight that contribution. And as you can see in the slide, there's been a very authoritative book written by Stephen Bourne on that contribution. The next slide, please. And equally, the same contribution was made yet again in the Second World War, drawing again from Africa, drawing from the Caribbean, from Britain, drawing from its colonies to recruit and have servicemen, and I hasten to add service women, as well as soldiers. There were ancillary workers and all of what went with that. Again, contributing to the war effort of that time. And here Barry Renfrew has written a very, very informative book talking about those Black regiments that took part in the Second World War. Thank you. Could we have the next slide, please? So, of course, many people now would have heard about Windrush. We have on the June 22nd, we have a Windrush holiday. The government has designated Windrush to denote a generation that came on this particular ship in the 50s. But I hasten to add that many African and African Caribbean people came prior to that particular ship and came after in the 60s by plane. And that was all part of economic immigration. People like Enoch Powell, who is known historically for his controversial Rivers of Blood speech, actually, during the 50s, went to the Caribbean to recruit Caribbean people into the NHS and to come and work on Britain's transport services. I mean, there's a real irony there, considering the speech that he made some years later. I would also hasten to add that as well, that when we think about the NHS, we had a recent exhibition in Leicester called Heart of Migration, which looked at the history of the NHS from Naya Bevin and noted and documented the mass exodus of many white English doctors in the wake of the nationalisation of health services, and that the gap, the skills employment gap, was filled primarily by Indian doctors. And later, of course, we know that there was African doctors coming from colonial hospitals set up in Africa. And of course, there were many, many nurses who came to work in the NHS, which helped stabilise and build the NHS. So we need to note that massive contribution to the NHS, which is, I'm sure, is not lost on the current audience. Thank you. The next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight something that when we think about Black history, this is Claudia Jones, who's actually been highlighted by Google. And it was clear then that Google understood that someone like Claudia Jones, who was in exile, actually, she was an American, Black American, who came to Britain and actually was a journalist and a political activist, but she's also credited as being the founder of our Notting Hill Caribbean Carnival, which is absolutely massive now. And it was interesting that Google worldwide highlighted this as part of October in 2020. And I include it because she was also a Black woman. So often when we're looking at Black history, we're looking at prominent Black men in history. So it was really good to see that Claudia Jones, who was exiled under McCarthyism in America and found a base in London for her to continue her work and her political and community activism here in Britain. Thank you. Next slide, please. I have provided as follow-up to this session a reading list, but then I remembered I'd forgot to include another important book, which is a book called The Black Atlantic by eminent sociologist Paul Gilroy, which I would recommend anyone to read. But I also included it because the idea of a Black Atlantic is that it's in our imaginary, the Atlantic, of course, with the transatlantic chattel slave trade, a lot of people were lost literally into the Atlantic Ocean, and there is the idea that there are many people at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. There is in fact some statuary in the Caribbean that's actually situated on the seabed of enslaved Africans. So I wanted to just include that is very much a very liminal and imaginary space in terms of the Atlantic Ocean when we're talking about Black history in general. Thank you. Next space, please. Next slide. So let's talk about some prominent Black Britons, if you will. And this is one of my favourites. John Blank, as you can see in this image, was at a big do for Henry VIII. And I think it was he was one of the trumpeters for Henry VIII. And what I love about this story about Henry Blank, he must have been a character, because John Blank found out that he was paid less than the other trumpeters, and he wasn't obviously very happy about that. And there is the record kept of his letter. So he was clearly someone who had access to education and was able to write. And he wrote a letter to Henry VIII. I don't know about you, but when I think of Henry VIII, I think of quite a formidable character, someone who would probably incite some level of fear. But he had the temerity and courage, I would say, to write to Henry VIII and say, look, I'm not really happy about this. They're being paid more than me. And actually, Henry VIII actually paid him what he wanted, and he paid him a bit extra. So I think the moral of the story is sometimes you need to stand up and be counted. But I think it's a lovely little story about a historical figure that I know when I was studying the Tudors at school, no one ever mentioned that there was Moors, Black people in society. Obviously, we knew about Othello, but Othello had a bit of a bad rap, killing Desdemona. But of course, when we think of Tudor England, we need to think about the fact that there was a Black British presence here at that time. And in fact, Henry VIII's daughter did issue a proclamation during her reign that there was too many blackamoors in the land. And that was a comment from her as the Queen at the time. So we do get an idea that there was quite a few, as they were called then, Moors, but make no mistake, Moors were African people. And when we look at why there were so many Moors in Britain and across Europe, we have to look at things that were happening in terms of the Moors were in Spain for many centuries, but that changed after Isabella and Philip took control of Spain. And many Moors moved across Europe and moved into other European countries. Thank you. So we'll have the next slide. So here's another interesting figure from Black history. This is Mansa Musa, who was a Mandinkan king from the West African empire of Mali. And Mali was known for having lots of gold reserves. And Mansa Musa was, and still is today, if you Google it on the internet, he's still classed as the richest man ever in history. And the reason for that is that he was a Muslim. There was Arab and North African conquest of West African tribes who were converted under jihad to Muslim faith. And he was a Muslim, and he decided he was going to go to Mecca, and he was going to make his pilgrimage. And contemporary accounts at the time tell us that he had a camel train loaded with gold on his way to Mecca. And en route to Mecca, wherever he went, he was traveling from West Africa to Mecca, which is in present day Saudi Arabia. And everywhere he went, he just gave people gold bars. And it was that had such an impact that when he went through Egypt, he actually crashed the Egyptian gold market because he was just giving away gold. And they said his camel train of loaded gold went as far as the eye could see. So this was an incredibly rich person, and he went to Mecca and gave gold away en route. But it's worth noting that Mansa Musa and others after him used their wealth to create ships that were sent to the Americas, to Central and South America, to go to the land on the other side of the sea, because they knew there were people there and there were people that they could trade with. And this is something that we know from archaeological evidence right back to Commetans and Egyptians. There are mummies with cocaine. The cocaine is only grown in South America. So there's clearly been travel and trade between Africa and the Americas prior to Columbus and the transatlantic. And also in terms of understanding that the newer archaeological evidence that's coming out, we know about the Vikings, but we're now knowing about Africans' settlements that are being found through the archaeological record in Central and South America. And it's also worth noting that Columbus and other European explorers coming out of the Renaissance used the maps of Moors. Moors were already aware that there were lands across the other side of the ocean, and they had the maps. In fact, it suggested that Columbus had a navigator who was actually a Moor. So again, this changes our narrative about Africa and in terms of the achievements and some of the discoveries that have happened in terms of Africa. So Mansa Musa and his gold. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show some images. There's lots of these. You can research lots of these. You'll find lots of Moors on coats of arms. The first images you can see are from Germany and parts of Balkan countries, where you will find heraldry, you will find pictures, you will find all sorts of artifacts depicting clearly Black African people, and Black African people in particular roles, whether they're in cardinals or whether they're knights or whether they're at court, they're clergy, or they're part of the iconography of a particular royal house. You will find this all across Europe, and particularly around medieval times and up until the 15th century. Next slide, please. Here we have one, an African knight with some sort of cardinal papal sort of person. Again, just to emphasize that there were Africans of high status right across Europe, undertaking lots and lots of different roles within the societies that they found themselves in. And in fact, there are some royal houses of Europe that have some sort of links and traces of African ancestry. So it's just to underline within the whole narrative of Europe, the medieval times, the Tudor times, and what have you, there were Africans around, some of them at court, some of them in different roles, musicians, troubadours, there's lots of different roles that Africans were playing across Europe, and of course within Britain's society as well. Thank you. Next slide, please, Alex. So here we have a Black Madonna. And again, when I was at school, I wasn't taught anything about Black people's presence in Europe during medieval times, or even before. I mean, there were Africans during early Christianity, founding fathers coming from North Africa and going to various places during Anglo-Saxon times. But, you know, again, I encourage you to look. All over Europe, you will find Black Madonnas, and there's all sorts of reasons given why the Black people say, oh, it's aging and, you know, the paint's gone dark, but actually this is incorrect. Black Madonnas are a staple, a cultural reality right across Europe in terms of Catholicism and that religion across Europe. And I just encourage people to look into probably why there are so many Black Madonnas and child, which harks back to the Kemetan image of Isis and Horus. So this is not a new image, but as we know throughout history, there's lots of borrowings and lots of appropriations and reinterpretations of imagery and artifacts in people's culture. So I'll just say, look into that one a bit more. But there's, you know, churches from Poland to, I don't know, Ukraine, Lithuania, you will find Black Madonnas and childs right across Europe. Okay, the next slide, please. So this is where it all went wrong. So when we talk about Black history, we must talk about what is termed now the African Holocaust. And it's called the African Holocaust because we're talking about 500 years of the creation of a racist ideology in order to justify transatlantic chattel slavery, but also white supremacy. And we have to understand that prior to this time, there wasn't the sort of idea of racism or xenophobia that we understand today. There may well have been some xenophobia, but there wasn't the racism that we understand today. And this is where it all went wrong, because Africans were the idea that Africa had all gold and resources, and there was Arab slavery prior to the European transatlantic chattel slavery. But what makes it different is the industrial nature and scale of the European transatlantic chattel slavery. So in this picture, which is a rather despondent image, we have to understand that this is the beginning of the arrested development of Africa and its diaspora. And this is where it starts. The demonization, the inferiority, the projection of many negative things about Africa and its people. I mean, it's irony that one of the caricatures of Africans is that they're lazy and shiftless, and yet they were worked to death, literally, during these periods of slavery. But what I want people to take away about this image, as grim and as despondent as it is that within this massive forced kidnapping, brutalization, genocide, massacre, everything that happened during the transatlantic chattel slavery is the idea of the arrested development. There were kings, there were queens, there were priests, priestesses, there were farmers, there were scientists, there were herbalists, there were doctors. The actual impact that caused is what I think people need to understand about what I say when everything went wrong. So within this picture, there are whole communities, whole villages, whole generations that have suffered arrested development as a result of transatlantic chattel slavery. And we are still dealing with the impacts of that today and trying to deconstruct and dismantle the negative ideology and practice and policies that really literally stem from this period when everything, as I call it, went wrong. The next slide, please. So I just wanted to share this other image about transatlantic slavery, just to highlight the greed, the rapacious greed, and the relentless pursuit of profit in terms of kidnap Africans as human cargo. And this is how people were advised to pack a ship. And I don't need to go into great depth about the inhuman, brutal, and unsanitary conditions of these ships, because that's well explained by many, many books. But also sometimes, like in the infamous story of the ship of the Zong, sometimes slaves were thrown overboard to claim the insurance. So this was a very brutal, very ruthless practice that went on for a very, very long time. Thank you. Next slide. So I'm going to swiftly move along to how do we get to the point where abolition happens. And abolition happens with twin forces at work. There's the abolitionists. Quakers were slave owners, and then they changed and became abolitionists. Well, of course, we have people like Wilberforce. We have memorists like Olaudah Equiano, where the horrors of slavery began to be known, and particularly certain Christian groups started to agitate and campaign for the abolition of slavery. But we must understand that starting from the liberation of Haiti under Toussaint Louverture in the 1800s, coming right down to the abolition by the British, we have had numerous slave resistance and rebellions. I would call them self-liberators. They were called Maroons. And these were people who ran away. These were people who went to live in the hills and created communities, and many of them gave sanctuary to other runaway slaves. And some of them actually intermingled with the indigenous Taino Indian people of the Caribbean islands. And here we have a picture of Nanny, who was a legendary guerrilla resistance leader. Lots of myths were made about her, that she bounced bullets off her buttocks, but she innovated things like guerrilla warfare, like having some of her men disguise themselves as trees, so the English redcoats would be walking through mountains and paths, and they wouldn't understand that they were walking into ambushes. She was a legendary figure, and I just think it's not always told in the narrative about abolition that it was down to the goodness of white people in Britain. We need to understand that the sugar trade did become uneconomical, and that there were those kind of drivers and all the rebellions and the resistance that was happening in the Caribbean islands that led to abolition as well. And it's also worth noting before we move on that when abolition happened, a couple of things happened that were untoward insofar as African people, and is that the white slave owners were compensated for losses of slaves, which included absent slave owners. David Olusoga has shown this very carefully in his books. So you had, widowed aunts in Britain who actually derived income from slave plantations. And we also need to be very clear that planters are slave owners. So we need to be clear about those terms. And then there was the whole idea that when slaves were freed, technically under abolition, that they weren't able to be freed, that they had to still work on plantations for very small income. And that happened for about, 3 to 5 years after the abolition, and they weren't allowed to get land and develop their own agriculture and become independent. So abolition wasn't the great thing it was seen to be at the time. There was some sort of slavery that carried on for 5 years after, and I'm talking in the British context of the Caribbean. Next slide, please. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some prominent Black Britons. So here we have Ignatius Sancho, who was a writer and composer. you know, in Britain, and you know, was writing beautiful music, and you know, had a bit of a charmed life, I think, in London society. So you know, I'd encourage people to find his music. It's very lovely. Next slide. And here we have Alado Equiano, who's famous because he actually wrote about his exploits. Well, I wouldn't say exploits, but he was actually enslaved and then he became free. And he wrote in a book which became something of a bestseller at the time and helped fuel the debate and discourse around abolition in Britain at that time. Next slide, please. Here we have George Bridgetower, a favourite of mine, an absolute genius of a violinist. And one of the stories I have about him to share with you today is that he was so brilliant. Beethoven wrote some music specially for him. And Beethoven came and played with him this music, and they were getting on absolutely great. And George Bridgetower did something that we would understand as improvisation on this piece of music, and this delighted Beethoven even more. But unfortunately, they did fall out sometime after over a woman, and Beethoven asked for his music back, and he gave it to another violinist who never ever played it. So that's my story there about George Bridgetower. Quite interesting. Next slide, please. Here on the left-hand side, we can see George Ryan, who was under Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. So if you're in London, you can go and have a good look at him in the statuary. I understand his gun is pointing possibly at the French sniper who actually fatally wounded Nelson. And he is mentioned, we know his name because he's in the ship records, and he's been identified as George Ryan. Of course, there were lots and lots of black seamen. Black seamen often became seamen, which is a very hard life, but it was seen as a better life than being a slave on a plantation, to be honest, even though it was very bad food and quite a harsh life. Next slide, please. Just a nice little one here. When some of these seamen became not needed anymore for wars or whatever, they ended up destitute on the streets of London. Here we have Joseph Johnson, who was a street entertainer at the time. Please note he's got a big ship on his head. And I just find it interesting when I'm in London to know that there were black people knocking around London. Some of them had pubs, but some of them were destitute seamen who chose to entertain people as street performers. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here we have Phyllis Wheatley. I've included her because she was the first black woman ever to be published in Britain. She was actually based in America, but she wrote her poetry and it was actually published in Britain. So this is quite a notable achievement at that early stage. I think it's in the 1800s or what have you. Very, very great achievement at that time. And you can find her poetry if you want to read it. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here we have Ira Eldridge. I think he would have been what we'd call a celebrity at the time, all over Europe. He was a celebrity. He was hailed as one of the greatest ever Shakespearean actors, and he was a black man who thrilled theatres all over Europe. So I wanted to include him because I'm a theatre maker myself. So that was it was nice to have him in there. Next one, please. And here we have one of our heroes, Mary Seacole, who looks a bit like my mum, to be honest. But there she was, this incredibly courageous woman who took herself off to the Crimean War and really innovated in terms of palliative care and giving comfort to British soldiers who were wounded. She was using her roots herbalism knowledge that had been passed on to her from her mother in Jamaica. African people on the continent and the diaspora are big on herbal remedies, but of course she was also giving them rum and easing their discomfort, you know, at the ends of their life. And she was dearly beloved and hailed and lionised by British servicemen in this country. And I think she now has a rightful place in British history and as an innovator in nursing care. Thank you. Next slide, please. And here we have Fanny Eaton. I was quite surprised when I discovered her. Like many people, I'd seen pre-Raphaelite art, and I didn't realise that she was the doyenne of pre-Raphaelite artists, and that she was a woman of Jamaican descent, and therefore a black woman, and you know, absolutely for her beauty, and was a muse of the pre-Raphaelite artists. I think she worked in I think she worked actually at the Royal Academy, so that's how they kind of came upon her. So yes, Fanny Eaton. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to close. Well, we're not quite at the end, but I've included John Edmondson, who was a black man who was at a university when Charles Darwin was a young man, and he taught Charles Darwin an awful lot about physiology. He was actually a taxidermist. So I found that quite interesting that Charles Darwin credits him with teaching him an awful lot. And we all know of the discoveries that Charles Darwin went on to make later on. But he learnt a lot about physiology from John Edmondson. I think it was the University of Glasgow. Next slide, please. I'm going to end with Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was really, you know, in his time, again, a celebrity in terms of classical music. He was a black man who was from London. He lived in London. He'd been to the Royal College of Music, and he wrote Hiawatha's Wedding and other famous pieces of classical music. And he went to America and toured in America and built a worldwide reputation as a classical composer at that time. So I'm going to draw it to a close at that point. I hope you found it interesting to just really have a whistle-stop kind of roller coaster through some Black history. But my aim was just to really stimulate and catalyse your own learning. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Carol. A fascinating talk. And I would like to open up the floor to ask questions. And Carol, you said you were happy to answer any questions that the audience might have. So are there any questions that, if you'd like to raise your hand or put a question in the chat box or in the Q&A?
Don't be shy.
Lee.
Thank you ever so much, Carol. I've learnt so much appreciated. My question would be, well, I know you've sent across a list of books for people to read.
And videos, actually, some videos to watch as well as books.
Okay, cool. Because that's what I was going to ask, because we know not everybody is willing to read a book in order to learn a bit further. So are there any particular points of media which you would suggest to offer to people who may be needing to be brought along on the ride?
Well, I think the videos and the books I've suggested are the starting points, really, from this talk, because it's a vast subject. And I think you need to start with some books and videos who can. So, for example, if I just take something about where do we get all this racist ideology from, and how do we understand how systematic racism works in your own work context, growing up, your own community, or the country at large? I mean, a lot of people don't understand that racism is an equation. You have to, you know, it's prejudice, yes, but it's prejudice plus the power to negatively affect other people's lives and outcomes. I can have as much prejudice as I like, but if I'm not affecting your housing, your job prospects, your health, whatever, then, you know, that's just prejudice. But, you know, how does racism work in society? But more importantly, where did it come from? Where do these ideas come from? So I think the videos and the books will help deconstruct and begin to frame things for people in a way that they could access the roots of these things.
Thank you, Alex, for putting a link in the chat box. There are books and videos, a list that can be found on the Connect page, where the recording of this webinar will be placed as well. Any more questions for Carol? Alex.
I mean, it feels like it's a no-brainer, but would you say that the impact of the Arrested Development that you mentioned is still felt today?
Still with us, not under the auspices of this talk, but when, you know, we have to talk about imperialism, colonialism, but we have to talk about neo-colonialism and how that manifests in IMF, world debt, you know, the rich global north and the poor global south, and all these things have historical roots and are still playing out today with unfair trade practices, and climate change is also a concern because some of these places have experienced ecocide and what have you. So yes, those things are still playing out today. I would also add, I've put on the reading list because there may be medical people here, or because, you know, you're NHS hospitals, a new book by Dr. Annabelle Sawimo, which I found absolutely compelling. And the book is called Divided: Racism, Medicine and Decolonizing Healthcare. And one of the things that's so shocking and powerful about that book is she does a lot of research into the basis of race medicine and diagnostic tools that are still being used today, and the research and experiments that were done on black bodies, some of them unethical, but have advanced science and eugenics. So, you know, if someone's got a bit of a medical bent in terms of black history, I would highly recommend that book.
Thank you very much indeed, and that's really helpful list and resource for colleagues.
But yes, people sometimes want to watch a video, they don't want to read a book.
Exactly. We're all different, we learn in different ways. Yeah. I've put a bid to Adam Brooks Charitable Trust for a number of books so that we can start an inclusion book club and a resource coming in 2024. And again, thank you, Carol, for your list of resources as well, that we can keep adding to.
Because I often hear, where do I start with all this? I mean, this is where Nesrine Malik or Reneo Eddie Lodge's books are quite good, because we feel very overwhelmed with culture wars and the kind of narratives and dialogues and debates that we see in the media. And it's often quite unhelpful, and people feel uninhibited to make the start. And I would just encourage people to start, to begin to find out for yourself about this history, this Black history, which is my history, which is actually your history, which is world history, and you've just not been told about it. So, and as I say, you know, it's a journey of discovery.
Thank you. Well, without further ado, I think I'd like to thank you very much, Carol, for your time and really insightful talk. Really interesting and fascinating. And the recording will be available on Connect. We'll share this widely on CUH Bulletin as well. So thank you all for joining us, and really delighted to have Carol for you talk to us today. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming on. I've enjoyed it, and it's just a beginning. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.